Doctor.
I'm really grateful to Dr. Thapar and all of you for giving me this opportunity. It's a rare occasion when I speak to purely, people at administrative levels, but I think it's a great opportunity because of various things that we see in the system nowadays, in our healthcare systems. Sorry. Okay, so this is one of the news you might have noticed 2 years ago, 1 year ago. That is Himanshu Roy, one of the dynamic strengths of anti-terrorist board of Mumbai Police. He committed suicide, and in his note he had written that I'm unable to deal with the pain which he felt in a holistic term. And according to his oncologist, it was not that physical problems were overtaking him, it was more of the mental issues. So this was quite like a person who is known to be courageous, known to take very positive, and he was very well known for his like go and get it done kind of an attitude. And another other aspect, the other side of it is the doctors being attacked by the crowd, patients and families because of various reasons. So these are all the few things which jolts us out of our comfort and think, what are we doing? What's happening? We are trying to do our best, and why is not being perceived as well? And we think of many things. So now I will tell you how I qualified in 90 as an MD anesthesiologist, and slowly how I transitioned into palliative care as a choice, so that probably that will give you an idea of my learnings, and then maybe there are some things which I may be able to convey during my talk. So I had 3 roles in my anesthesiology area. One is as an anesthesiologist, one was as a critical care person, because in those days there were no intensivists as such. We used to manage most of the critical care units of the hospital. I'm talking about in late 80s and 90s, okay, early 90s. So, and we were also given the responsibility of managing pain in the institution. So there were 3 roles that we were handling. So each of those roles, I'm just giving you examples, but actually many things must have gone into my head. So one was that, when we do anesthesiology, we want everything to go uneventfully and patient should be well. So I had this patient who was for Whipple's, and patient was for Whipple's, and we were not very sure. I mean, the surgeons were not sure whether it will be Whipple's or not, because they were not sure of the extent of the disease. Anyway, for my job, it was peri-op uneventful, my goal. So I had used various techniques, and also epidural, high up thoracic epidural, so that patient gets a good post-op recovery without pain. Now I go back to the next day. This was around 12 hours of surgery. And then I go back the next day. Ultimately, the operation was, not done, because they had to do some palliative surgeries because the thing had spread more. So I went the next day to refill the epidural pump into the post-op ICU, and patient is discharged. Oh. Now patient is discharged against medical advice, okay, because they don't have the funds to continue being, because the complications were not featured into the package that was told to the patient. We all give packages based on everything going well. So the family was not prepared, and the hospital was also not prepared to handle the extra expenses. So the patient gets discharged, first day post-op, that is something that jolts you, right? So that was something that made me think. And they don't even get the claim, because we don't even give a proper discharge, and these people are not allowed to get their medical claim also. So you see the repercussions on the family and the patient. The other thing was, as a pain physician, there was this patient who came with a particular tumor which required maxillary nerve to be blocked for his pain relief. So I was focused again on the nerve, and I did a good job, gave him pain relief, and about within 2 weeks I come to know that he committed suicide, okay, because my job was only looking into the nerve. And he had many other questions, and he was going through depression, he was going through many things. I did not bother to engage with anything except my job, which was on the nerve. And I was very happy that my job is done. So something was hugely missed here. Third thing was, as an intensivist, I am again focused on the saturation, PO2, PCO2. And so if any of you all have spent enough time in the ICU. I'm sure you all must have come across patients where you'll say, I wish this patient dies. Isn't it? It is not that, if otherwise we have to be inhuman to not think of that, So same thing, there have been instances where we are witness to sterile, isolated, undignified deaths in the ICU. So these are the few things which jolted me into thinking about, what exactly are we talking to patients, what exactly are we communicating? Despite all our technical know-how, where is it, what is, we are not really doing what we came into medicine for. So then when I say the saturation, when each of us talk about with the patient's family, that so-and-so intervention, for example, artificial ventilation, will improve the saturation, we are again looking at the parameters. Now, what the patient hears often, the family hears, is that they are going to, the whole thing is going to improve and they will go back with their mother. When we say something is going to improve, we are looking at a very effect of our intervention. Whereas the family is looking at the benefit. Okay, at the end of it, I will take my father home or my mother home or whatever. That is what they are hearing. We don't understand that gap in the communication when we say something. So this much I understood. And so this maintaining one parameter or looking at one nerve or doing one part of the surgery did not serve the purpose for which we have joined medicine. And the options, I'll just elaborate on especially the ventilator part, because what options do we have in the hospital? Either they choose the ICU ventilator if they are crashing, like saturation dropping, BP dropping, that's all. Or, you sign a DNR. Yeah. And, there is no other third choice we give. And the second other thing is, in a very general hospital kind of setup, a screen is put around the patient. And, they are almost like when we go on rounds, okay, this is DNR, next. So we move on to the next ward, next bed. We don't even look at this patient as to, okay, he's dying, but is there any need which we need to take care of? Patient may be struggling with various things. A patient who is dying does not mean he is unconscious and not suffering at all. We just don't pay attention to it because we have been taught to look at death as a failure, as though we can manage to let them come out of death. Third option is LAMA, leaving against medical advice. So these are the only three options that the patients have. We need to be mindful of it. And India is one of the worst places to die according to the Economist survey. And we fall 67th in the list of 80 countries where the quality of death index was taken. And we think that this is happening to poor patients? Definitely not. Now, and it also costs a high percentage of cost. So you see, India falls into those countries where 80 to 90% of the patients are paying out of pocket. Very low insurance rate. So you might know better the numbers, but the latest I read was around 60 million people go below the poverty line every year purely due to healthcare costs. I couldn't believe it, but I don't know whether the number is true, but that is what is published in some report. So this is huge. This is not like, I have myself seen patients getting into deluxe ward the first time. Then as the disease progresses, they go into, shared rooms and then general ward, and, life becomes impossible even at home for the healthy people. Now, we talked about patients going into poverty, but what about an extremely influential, who has access to the best of healthcare? Let us see. Now, this person everybody knows. And he was a philosopher, he was a poet, and he had kidney disease, and he had dementia and various other comorbidities. And at 93, with all these comorbidities, he was put on dialysis from June to October. Okay, he was totally demented by that time when he was in the last stages. It was not like, so there are parameters, decision around the dialysis. There are various criteria of not going ahead with dialysis. All those criteria he has met, but still, we offer what we have. Like, we have this, so I have it, so I'll show it, that. So he was put on dialysis. Not only that, he had pneumonia, etc., and he was put on ECMO, the membrane oxygenator, during the last day, said the doctor, on condition of anonymity. So can you imagine, the more influential you are, in fact, you have worse death. You might have heard of Jyoti Basu, you might have heard of Jayalalitha, Sai Baba. Everyone had really terrible deaths because there are people around who wants to do something, without thinking about what would be the impact. So these are a few things. Now, Parthasarathi Shom is an economist of eminence. He was an advisor to Prime Minister. This is what he has to say about his mother. See, he is educated, he is very influential, but I could give no choice to my mother who pleaded to be taken home. Such was the pressure I felt from the specialist in the ICU to do something. And even on the last day of passing, a specialist recommended a procedure. And when I asked why, will it end the coma, answer was negative. And then the reason given was that it is their responsibility to make available everything that is there in the hospital. So he writes in Business Standard, he has written an article about this particular thing, and he says, where is empathy and where is care? You know, despite the mother wanting to go, there was no system in our hospitals to allow this kind of a choice. Everything is only for interventions, and there is no space for that flexibility for a humane end, you know. So this is, I'm talking about this dying and death because that is where everything gets blown very, very clearly. It is difficult to, and this happens even in an ordinary consultation and even in, you know, very complicated. But this is where I can clearly show what is the impact at all levels, emotional, social, financial, every level, even spiritual. Is this the way anybody, like if I give you a choice of, you know, where would you like to die? You know, now that you all are healthy, you all can think about it very clearly. Would you like to die in a home or in a hospital? Oh, very clear, right? Who would you like to have around you? Would you like to have family? But what about, you know, US returned extremely well-trained intensivist and the best equipped intensive care? Why not? Would you choose? No. See, it's so clear for us because we know what goes on in the ICU. But what do we do when it comes to our turn? When the patient is wanting to make a choice, we enforce this particular environment during the most crucial time. It's an important phase of life, how they leave. It leaves an impression with the family. It allows the person to touch peace during that time. And that is the time, all that what we want, we don't allow the patients to have. So that's something we need to keep in mind. And this rift between institutions and, you know, whether it is middle class, poor class or rich class is constant. It is not like it is anything different. Now I started looking for a meaning, and I looked at the, you know, definition of medicine, and it says in Oxford Dictionary that it's a science and practice of diagnosis, treatment and prevention of disease. Okay, so I could not buy this because my experiences said that patient is not a container of disease. There are organs in the body, but the organ is not coming to me for treatment. It is the person who is coming. And person is not just a bag full of different organs put together. I need to know bigger. So then how do we view the patient, you know? So it just happened that I was teaching embryology to one of my nieces, and it just struck me. And I checked back in my embryology book whether my thinking was right. So there are these 3rd to 4th week, if you go into the embryology of our human, any evolution actually, any organ, there are 3 layers. The mesoderm, ectoderm, endoderm, right? And these are the ones which finally become all the different organs of our body. It was amazing to note that ectoderm ends up becoming all the nervous system organs, skin, sense organs. Mesoderm ends up becoming muscle, tendons, bones and everything, as well as the excretory and the reproductive system. Endoderm ends up becoming the gastrointestinal, you know, little bit of endocrine, it's a mixed one, and respiratory. Now, if you look at it from a holistic viewpoint, it's amazing that these are the organs of perception, these are the organs of action, and the other one is the one which gives energy. So, did we get embryology taught in this manner? We had to cram and think, you know, which layer gives rise to which organ. If we are taught, when we are learning from first MBBS, if we are taught a human being is evolved in this manner only to experience, what does this mean? We are created, our whole purpose of life is to experience life, and that is being missed out because of our going detail into detail into detail. So that was something that struck me, and, you know, I thought it made sense. So I looked at, you know, life as exhilarating experiences, communicating experiences, and, you know, day-to-day routine experiences. And even if you look at disease is also an experience. One of the experiences that a human being goes through, right? And healthcare is an opportunity to influence this experience, because our whole purpose of coming alive as a human body is to experience life. So when we look at it that way, it becomes a little more clear as to what is our real purpose of being in this profession. Ayurveda touches upon little more clearly. They say that to provide healthcare so that patient may experience the fullness of life and is able to pursue their purpose of life. That is what is the reason for Ayurveda according to their definition. It makes tremendous sense, because then it gives us a clear idea. Suppose I am seeing a patient who is requiring a crashing, whether whatever intervention, this artificial ventilation or a dialysis, is it going to bring some meaning into that person's life which is meaningful to that person? If it's just going to beat some heart and keep the saturation moving, that is called an effect. Whereas the benefit is, I'm going to get out of the hospital and I'll be able to be mother, I'll be able to be a doctor or teacher or whatever my profession is. Then it makes sense to me. If I'm just going to beat my heart and be alive, 5 years survival will be taken care of. You call me at the end of your survey period, 5 years are over, is this Dr. Nandini Vallath alive? And if the family says, yes, I am a tick mark in your success, in your survey. But how I spend those 5 years, whether I was in comatose state, doesn't matter to you. So the quality of life becomes, a big question when we look at why we are doing something for a patient. So this sort of, I thought, because palliative care is the only place where I found that there is some kind of quality of life being discussed. Patients and families is there in the definition itself, and it looks at suffering, it looks at meaning and different realms. That is, prevention, early detection, treatment of concerns at physical, psychosocial, emotional, or all levels. So this particular field of medicine, which is relatively new, which is not more than 20-25 years in India, it gave me some kind of a window to express myself in the way I understood my role as a doctor. So now to elaborate on it based on 3 different levels, I thought structure and processes has to, because it's not just me who has transitioned. I see that healthcare systems have transitioned. It's not like how it was when I was, qualified as MD at 1990. So this structure and processes, let's just focus on it. So now we have acute, say, pneumonia. Ashish is a child with a pneumonia, whereas Ahmed is a person with paraplegia. Now, you see that acute illness, patient is normal, he becomes abnormal because of some illness, pneumonia, whatever issues. Then you treat it, patient is back to normal. So there is, a phase of illness and they are going back to normal. Our healthcare system is beautifully aligned, designed to support acute episodic care. When it comes to chronic illnesses like, say, cirrhosis or, advanced diabetes, cardiac failure, cancer, all of them, we don't want to know about the whole disease. Only if you have some problem which you can't handle, come and admit. That acute episode we'll see, again we don't want to see you. So it is that kind of thing. So trajectory has been recognized now that acute, there is different trajectory, and chronic, it's a different trajectory. So chronic disease, patient gets admitted, gets a little better, but it's not as normal as it used to be. Each admission, the person is getting lower and lower in his health status, right? So when we compare the same kind of healthcare system which is appropriate in acute care, it may not apply to the long-standing conditions, including old age. Even old age is something like that. So our interventions, now there is so recognition of disease trajectory is a huge transition. I don't think I heard this word throughout my MBBS or MD, disease trajectories. It was all about diseases. Now this is about disease trajectory. Second thing is proportionate interventions. We were just taught, DNR or CPR. So either you do it, and if the patient doesn't want to do it, then it is DNR and we are not responsible, that kind of an approach. But there is no like CPR, when we are learning, we are not taught when to reconsider. From our side, when to do it is very clear, but when to reconsider, would it be appropriate to do this on this patient is not taught. So proportionate interventions, I'm just talking about CPR, but this holds true for any intervention, whether it is dial, anything that causes a lot of what you call burden on the person, then we need to really think whether the benefit and the so I hope you've understood what is benefit and effect. Yes. Effect is only on an organ or a parameter. Whereas benefit is something that the person can, recognize, or it makes meaning to that person. So a proportionate intervention, what is appropriate at an earlier stage of disease trajectory, dialysis, ventilation, everything may be appropriate in a COPD patient who's quite okay, otherwise moving about well, talking, doing all his work. It is absolutely essential and must be done. But the same intervention, when it is done later, it may be inappropriate. So we have to recognize the different positions of the patient in the disease trajectory so that we can know what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. Okay, so that was one of the things. So effect versus benefit clarity. Futile care means that care which fails to achieve the benefit. And who will decide the benefit? So all of us want to increase longevity. We all want to increase the quality of life. That is our profession. But suppose there is a question between one and the other. I can only increase this or that. Then sacrificing one for the other is best done by an informed patient. So informed patient means we need to give them adequate information as to what can be expected from this, what is the possible benefit, what are the possible harms, what if we don't do it, what are the other options. All these have to be given for an informed consent. So informed consent is not just a piece of paper where we'll say this will happen to you, you will die on table, this, that, and the patient, poor thing, will sign at the end of it and we'll say, okay, we have done our job. Is it what do you think informed consent form is? Because it's not going to help us even in the court of law. It's just a communication. So what exactly is patient doing? Why is he signing on it? What does it mean?
He should be aware of all the procedures.
Yeah, that is our end. But actually, from his, now I am a patient side, I'm like changing my hat, I am from the patient side. Why do I sign it? Even though I can read that I can die on table, I'm still.
You're giving up control. Basically, I feel the patient.
Why does the patient give up control?
They trust in the patient. They trust you.
They trust you.
They know you do best for them.
Yeah, they think that we are going to do everything in their best interest. Despite all that horrible things written in the consent form, they sign because they trust. So it's a document of trust. It is not a legal or medical, all the other things we should know, but this is the most important thing we should remember. It's a document of trust. And this, you know how it is done. As an anesthetist, I've seen patient is anesthetized. Now they have forgotten informed consent. So they bring the form and tuck, done. So sometimes it happens that way also. But all that apart, what we should know is that it's a document of trust. Now, so this is where the clinical ethics come in. That is another transition. We used to have research ethics and all in detail before, but now there are actually clinical ethics bodies within hospitals, which when there are complex, dilemmas, clinical dilemmas. Now, dilemma, we should understand that when there is a clear distinction between what is right and what is wrong, there is no dilemma. Dilemma is when there is one right and another also looks like right. Then there is a dilemma, okay? So when there are such issues like a very, very small child, patient is unlikely to come out of the ventilator, the parents are, not sure. That is, very difficult situation to decide on what's to be done. So that is a time when the clinical ethics board can meet, discuss and make choices. So this is another transition which is coming in, not in many hospitals, but it will be great if every hospital has clinical ethics board, not the ethics review board. That is for research. That is totally different. This is clinical ethics, only for patients within the institution. And this will also support what we have recently, there is unfortunately it is called Passive Euthanasia Act which has come, which is a complete misnomer. I don't think that today's lecture gives me scope to talk more about it, but this will also be useful in handling situations like that. When we have some other occasion, I'll talk more. So, Hutchison, anyone remembers?
Yes.
From our first MBBS?
Yes.
Correct? So, he also wrote a poem, which I really enjoyed reading. From inability to let alone, from too much zeal for the new and contempt for the old, from putting knowledge before wisdom and science before art, cleverness before common sense, treating patient as cases and making cure of the disease more grievous than endurance of the same, good Lord deliver us. So this was the same Hutchison who gave us the wonderful book of, First MBBS. So, so that is, this is what I was trying to. So then WHO has also come out with principles of chronic hair. Now, assess and advise is where all of us sit very comfortably. We do it all the time. We assess, we advise, we assess, we advise. But the other three in chronic disease becomes crucial. Agree, whatever I'm advising, is it possible that the patient is able to handle that prescription? So even if you give prescription A, which is the A plus best is prescription, if the patient can't, have that, avail it because of economic reasons or for side effects or whatever, or some sort of phobias, we need to understand that. So whatever we prescribe, it's not just drugs or anything, sit across and discuss clearly whether they agree with that mode, and then give them the assistance and the care that they may need, arranging things for them. So this is 5 A's of chronic care which WHO has prescribed. The presence of multidisciplinary teams. It is also a new transition because all these are related to structure and processes of the healthcare system, which I am trying to list here. So physiotherapies and occupational therapy, rehab, all these have become very, very big and elaborate in different, and people are understanding that outcome, functionality is most important. Like pains, we are very good at managing pain, but even when we are managing pain, our end result is not to bring pain to zero. Because that zero may cause more side effects. We may want the pain goal to be what make the person active. We don't want someone to be pain-free and dozing. We want the person to be having maybe mild pain but active. So that kind of outcome should be very clear in our mind. And so there are processes for shared decision making. I told you about, just like how I discussed, what would you prefer? We do this routinely in palliative care where we sit across families. We have the training for it. So we sit across families with all the important decision makers, maybe the elder son or the uncle or whoever it is, the decision maker. We sit across them and discuss what is possible, what may be done, what can be expected, and answer their questions. Give them time. We cannot do this when the patient is crashing because that time things are very emotional. They will say, do something, doctor, do something. They don't have time to think and digest the whole information. This has to be done. As I told, we go back to the disease trajectory. So as soon as we see that this person is going towards only downward spiral, we can start talking about it and say, please think about it. Let them have a sheet of written document to think about, discuss with their family physician so that there is some clarity in their mind actually when it is required. Otherwise, what happens is at the threshold of the ICU, chahiye ki nahi chahiye? DNR sign karne ka nahi. So they are all emotional, this thing, turmoil. Obviously, they will say do something. They have not been given any clarity. And even when the person is, in the ventilator on inotropes with maybe, all kinds of support systems going on, what do we go out and tell the family? We'll say, patient is stable. What do they hear? When we say patient is stable, we have in our background all the things that is there, but they don't know. They think patient is getting better. We have to say, right now we are able to maintain the BP, but this is supporting it. We are able to maintain saturation, but the whole work is being done by a machine. Unless we become clear and honest in our communication, that is why people break the hospitals, because they are under the impression that patient is getting better, and one fine day you tell them patient has died. We have not prepared them mentally from the time of deterioration. That is where our issues are happening, even assault wise or patient having emotional peaks of suicide, etc. So this is the shared decision making, very, very huge thing. Care dunking is another thing which we could do as hospital administrators. You all can create systems within your hospital right from registration. There are tools available to detect many issues. You all can decide, like patient is sitting in the OPD area waiting without any useful, valuable work being done. But a lot of things can be done while they're waiting in the OPD area to ensure that their priorities are recorded. Is it being addressed? So there are a lot of ways of bringing care. We cannot say there's no time. There are multiple places where the patient is simply waiting. Families are simply waiting. We can use those time to understand why they have come to the hospital, what is their highest priority. It may not be what we think will be the highest priority. Now, scientific research, this is quality of life. I just took PubMed screen and then I hit quality of life as as one of the search items in the engine, and I took it from 60 to 70 right up to 2010 to 2019. You see how it has increased, the number of publications exponentially, and the last 10 years you can see it has just crossed the top. So this has become very obvious from everyone's point of view, from 18 publications just few decades ago, how it has climbed up. So the research is available there if we look for it. If we are still going to look for disease organ-based research, we will only see that. But if you want to look at the whole person and what impact it has, it is there. So there is this Lancet with Johns Hopkins. They have, no, this is not from Johns Hopkins, but this is a commissioned report, 2018 it has been published. So this report brings up a huge concept called serious health-related suffering. It's a worthwhile, it is free online, you can Google and find that out. And they have shown how many millions of people have serious health-related suffering at these realms, physical, emotional, social and spiritual. And they have advocated an essential palliative care package in public health system as well as in the individual institutions. So this is another huge research support for activity. So there is nothing to offer, like, I don't, my job, if it is not going to help you, I don't have anything to offer you. That's commonly something that, patients hear. Okay, your cancer has become incurable, you don't have to come back to me now, you can go whatever. But patient is not going to die next day. Patient is not going to die next week. He may live for months or maybe more than that. How does he live? There is no system currently to where they can go back to. They will have nausea, vomiting, pain, constipation, bed sores, all kinds of things. And don't we know how to handle them? We all know how to prevent it, how to handle it. We have enough medicines. Only thing is they are not directed appropriately. So this kind of approach causes in India, 96% of adults and 99% of children with severe pain do not have access to pain relief. Because I don't know, how many of your hospitals have oral tablet morphine available? You see how many few? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the entire group, which is considered if you look into the national list of essential medicines, this is an essential medicine, one of the essential medicines, and we don't have it. Why we don't have it? Because how many of you learnt about tablet morphine in MBBS or MD? None of us, including me. I have only known injection morphine. Yeah. So our knowledge about morphine is all to do with what happens, respiratory depression, addiction. So that fear has, we extrapolate that fear into oral morphine, which is very different. The pharmacodynamics are different. So I learnt about oral morphine only when I transitioned into palliative care. And then I discovered that there are so many barriers to, even suppose I want to prescribe morphine, patient will take the prescription from where we'll get.
You have to give the DD26 form and all.
No, and also where is it stored? Most hospitals don't store it. Most pharmacies don't store it. So we keep giving tramadol and what is that, Brufen and diclofenac, and that's just a chicken feed for this cancer pain. It's so huge. You need to have bigger medicines. And we don't, and it's cheapest. It costs about $1, for one tablet. So nobody is there to market it. How many of you all have fentanyl patches in your? I'm sure there will be more. Do you know that both of these fall into the same category of rules? NDPS Act covers both these. These come into exactly the same group of strong opioids. But there are people to market fentanyl patch because the profit margin is more. So the hospitals, even if you're in a forest, you will get patch. Somebody will come and give it to you. But in a tablet morphine, it will be tough. Okay? So just keep it in mind, because you all are administrators. You should make sure that these things are made available eventually, because it makes so much of a difference to a person with an incurable cancer who doesn't have to shoot himself, or you don't have to go, whatever thing they do to illicit way of acquiring pain medication. All those we can avoid by clearly, there is a system now in India which can allow this it's called RMI, recognized medical institution, and there is just a application required to be given to the state drug controller, and there are requirements of a doctor who undergoes basic training in using oral morphine, because it has not been taught in MBBS and MD. So these are the things. So what do you have to say about Like, why do you think I have kept this?
Half empty and half full.
Yeah, it's a trick question because that is not my intent. So basically, my question is, how heavy is this glass? Become heavier the longer you hold it. Exactly. The longer we hold it, heavier it becomes. So the symptoms are the same. We have a toothache, and one day it will be severe and we take off. We may not even come to work. These are patients who are holding that pain for endless. So just holding a glass for long enough, like 1 hour, it will be too much, and half a day, I just it's not possible for me. So you should understand that patients are holding all their issues. Chronically ill patients are holding it for days and days and weeks and months. So we need to be conscious that these are all real pains. It's not some kind of, not even like toothache. It's deeper. Like someone described it, one of the patients described it as like what is it called as? Iron which has been heated in fire. If you drill it into my jaw every second of the day, how much that pain will be. It is that kind of pain. That is how he described his pain. And this is something which he's going through every second. So, and not for like a week or something. It's for rest of his life until he dies. So no wonder some of them kill themselves because they can't handle it and they don't have access to these very, very cheap and, so-called listed essential medicines. I hope this is, you all have some idea that this is an important aspect of caring for our hospital patient. So there are systems in place to, assess these things. And this is a wonderful book I read recently, Compassionomics. It collates lots of research studies as to why empathy is important from not just patient feeling good and comfortable, from economics point of view. Because many of you all are, also are responsible for ensuring how much money gets lost, without, having value for it. So one of my pitches for corporate hospitals for the symptom management, empathy and all is like, for example, I think all of you have to show, especially those from corporate sector, you will have to show that, these many beds are appropriately used. So you all know that whenever a patient is admitted new in a bed, the maximum income to the hospital is in the first week. Correct? First 2 weeks, let us count. If the patient stays beyond that, actually, you're losing money because another new patient on that bed would have brought in more money. Now, why does a patient, usually all the investigations, decisions, diagnosis is done in the 2 weeks. Why does a patient stick on? Because we haven't addressed some of these symptoms or other issues which are pending. So suppose you incorporate care component into patient's care, patient will be discharged sooner. So that is a big advantage for you because you will have your bed free for the next admission. So from economics point, that is not the only message here. I encourage you to read through because there are lots of research studies listed here. But one of the points which I have myself noticed is this. So this is the WHO health-related quality of life, symptom control, functionality, psychosocial well-being, and meaningful life. So if we can manage this through our inputs, then we are doing a good job. So instead of Sri Vajpayee undergoing dialysis and looking at all the parameters, we know that he was a poet and he has himself written this poem. I'll just keep silent for a minute, you all can read through. If he had been given a choice, would he have chosen the way he died? I'm not at all sure. And this is another person who was equally influential. He could have had the best of healthcare. And Senior Bush, he died at home, surrounded by family. Do you think he didn't have access to healthcare? But they had a choice there. There are systems in the healthcare system in place. So he passed away aged 94, surrounded by family in his home. And even his wife had, at the age of 92, she also signed a statement saying that I don't prefer to seek additional medical treatment and instead focus on comfort. This kind of opportunity needs to come as a conventional practice in the healthcare system. For all that I talked till now, unless this is brought in, there is no place that the patient and family has to put in their choices, priorities, and their individualized preferences. So, any questions till now? I have another section pending about professional training, but we could take some questions.
So, ma'am, like one question, like when is the right time, like if the patient will be deciding, or like you would be advising the patient, like this is the time, because the graph you were showing, that there is a plateau. After that, it is.
That is just a representative.
Like that is
Smile.
shows the phase of like.
Yeah.
So when it is the right time.
Actually, the WHO suggests that diagnosing a chronic disease is the right time.
Okay.
When we know that even a juvenile diabetic, he has to live with it for rest of his life. So we need to make him understand this is a long-term condition. So at that stage itself, we have that time our conversations are different. Like the importance of all the education that we do regarding say diet or importance of monitoring his sugar. All those things are going to feature in first. But as soon as they start getting complications, I think that would be the time to talk about transitions, like this can happen again. So there is no particular time. It all depends on whatever graph I drew is just something that came at that point of time for me. It could be, actually there are different graphs for, this is more relevant for a system failure, like say liver disease or COPD, where he gets an infection, he gets admitted, thoda ventilator ho gaya, some antibiotic given, then he comes back. Then again he gets infected. In a cancer, it doesn't look exactly like that. It looks like this, and then very quick fall. Okay, once the person gets metastasized, it's much quicker. So the chronic trajectory, disease trajectory for cancer is different. For say old age related, it is a very slow. The frailty, old age, and all, it's very unpredictable. So there are different trajectories for different types of chronic disease. And if you go to the NHS site, national, that's UK NHS site, and put disease trajectories, and the entire. In fact, they also give you when would you think that this transition of care goals can be usefully communicated. So they have given say FEV1 so and so. In a COPD patient, if these parameters are going out of bounds, then you start discussing. So you are given guidance as per the disease in the NHS website if you are specifically interested in any disease. Any other question?
Ma'am, I have one.
Yep.
In your experience, if I were the patient, I would personally take it as my doctor is throwing up their hands in the air and saying that they've given up on me. When the doctor starts talking about transitioning from care to palliative care, I would personally feel that there's no more hope in life. So in your experience, have you come across such patients? Is that a given that patients do not digest that information, that I'm finally dying and there's no more hope?
Yeah, of course.
So
All the time.
Yeah.
So it all depends on our communication skills. We are not having communication skill. That brings me to the next part of the talk, that is about the training. Why do we, do it like breaking of an egg? Like, this is what is there and, done. And, it's off my chest. So that is not the way to break bad news. So change in prognosis is a bad news. Diagnosing a disease like cancer is a bad news. Bad news is anything that will very severely affect the life of the person henceforth, correct? So even diagnosis can be bad news. Even a curative cancer diagnosis is very, devastating to a person. For an oncologist, they'll say, what hysterics are going on? This is curable. But they don't understand that from the patient's point of view, it is devastating. Cancer itself is such a difficult word for them to use from their mouth. They will say all kinds of words, euphemisms. They will not use the word cancer. Family also. So you need to understand that even curative long-term disease is a death sentence kind of a thing. So it all depends on our skills. We now 2000, like I'll just go further because that will partly answer your question. Sorry. So training about how to talk about, things. And another barrier that comes in is the family saying,
in front of us.
don't tell the patient, right? So commonly they say that, don't tell him. So that is called collusion. So we are, as professionals, we are colluding with the family to not tell the patient the real situation. So that is also something we require training in managing. So handling collusions and breaking bad news, there are 2 modules which we have to learn in communication skills, which we never had. Ethics, we have it, that in MBBS, somebody is there from forensic medicine here. Yeah. So in forensic medicine MBBS, we have When we studied also, ethics existed, but we didn't get taught, that's all. But now there are some systems in place. So have you noticed that a 17-year-old, 12th standard, who is exuberant because they have got into medicine, becomes a 10, 22-year-old MBBS doctor, little bit ashamed of, just being MBBS. I'm nobody. And this is the same person who had been, celebrated as some achiever in 12th standard. So what are we doing in our system of education? What are we doing to that wonderful 12th standard person who comes into medicine, and we are breaking him and saying that you are useless unless you specialized or unless you do this or that or some achieving. It's terrible. So the hidden curriculum, we have subjects etc., but the hidden curriculum we have to be conscious about. So every system has processes designed perfectly to get the results it gets. So there is a reason why the MBBS student is feeling low, because the only buzz that he hears around him is, okay, what are you going to do after MBBS? Anybody says, I'm not going to do, how non-ambitious, how useless, that kind of approach we have. So the hidden curriculum are, subjects are taught in silos without connection. We have to, maybe 10 years after we pass out, we sort of fit in the jigsaw puzzles and say, oh, we learned that in physiology, maybe it is useful here. If I could go back to MBBS now, I would have done it so much better. Because I had no idea why I was learning all those things. Now I know where is the place for what. Same thing, MCQ monsters, we are creating. Because everything is checked in MCQ. So the doctors are not coming out. We are bringing out MCQ monsters. They will answer, and patient does not say, okay, tell me whether I have 1, 2, 3, 4. They're not going to give you choice. We have to work out. We have to be problem solvers. We have to have associative intelligence. That is what we need to create in them. Instead, we have MCQ and MCQs. So they are coming out as MCQ monsters. And acute episodic care I have touched upon. Power hierarchy. Throughout their training, they see that consultant or a professor, dang, and patient is in the lowermost hierarchy. So there is hardly any space for the patient to sit in front of the doctor and say, hey, no, I have to say something more. You haven't listened to me. Its history is his story. We are not wanting to hear that. So, we are, in fact, there is a study which says that, a doctor, if the patient becomes silent, doctor, how long do you think he can stay silent or allow silences? There is a study. It was 11 seconds. In 11 seconds, if the person does not speak, the doctor will interject and say, so, da-da-da-da-da, okay? So, silence in a patient and family actually means lot of noise in their head. They don't know what to say next. They are going through so much of complex thinking and, they are so confused. They're trying to understand, what to say next to the patient, next to the doctor. It's not like they don't have anything to say. So if we allow silences, we may learn more about patients' wishes and priorities. So power hierarchy and reward system. Specialization is rewarded. Then, CPR. Getting the heart back into beating something is rewarded, code blue. Whereas reconsidering CPR is not something that we think about. And the matrix, generally how they see as they are learning, what they see all around you, the rude words. So suppose there is a consultant who is treating the patients extremely well, that person's residents are going to emulate that and they are going to become far better. So some of them naturally, all of us, we have different talents. Some of us naturally have talents to be empathetic in our conversation. Some of us may not have, but it's a trainable skill. If it is seen, attitudes are always learned by seeing or, seeing our professors, and if we can get it emulated, make it into a non-negotiable aspect of the hospital etiquette, that no doctor will, sort of use these kind of approaches, then automatically the juniors are going to improve, the students are going to improve, and they're going to be better doctors. So,
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yep.
I have a question.
Yep. Where? Oh, yeah. Thanks.
See, there are cases when the patient is not in a condition to decide for his own future of treatment. So, in that case, is the family completely responsible to take whatever decision they want?
Yeah, good question. So suppose your situation is you're talking about when the person is unconscious
Or
or they don't want to.
in condition to decide.
Yeah. Yeah, so I can answer that question in two ways. One is where the patient is fully functional, conscious, but they don't want to take a decision. Is something whether I learnt it. So as a doctor, I need to first find out, is this the kind of person who has always been taking decisions, nothing to do with disease, say about which house to buy or whatever. If a person, there's a general personality, right? Some people are always dependent on someone else's decision. Some people take active participation in the decision. So my job, suppose a relative says that no, my father won't decide, we will decide for the father, then I will ask these questions to the family, like what kind of a person he was, like would he then so like that we need to work and understand if that person is really that kind of a person who has always depended on others. Okay, and at the same time, if the person directly asks me, tell me doctor, what is the disease I have, or tell me doctor, what is this, our primary bond is with the patient. That is the clinical patient bond. So we have to always inform the family that if the person asks for that, we will have to handle it in some way. I cannot lie to my patient. I can go around, but your question is basically, my job is to find out if that person belongs to that category. Suppose it's done to me. Suppose my son says, no, don't tell my mother. I would be angry with my family because I'm the type of person who likes to decide, like whether I want to go, aggressive way or just care way. So that is important to understand the type of personality. Suppose a person is unconscious, then what we try to do is we ask the family, suppose he were to take, if he had the choice to make a decision like this, because as a son or a brother or a wife, the way we think is based on our needs. I want somehow this person to be alive. We don't so much think, but when we give them that idea that, think like your father, what would your father have liked? What would your mother have liked in this situation? Then they are able to take a better decision. So these are the two areas, and if there is a doubt, there is always a possibility of giving a trial. For example, dialysis. Now, someone like Vajpayee, like suppose that kind of a person comes to me, he has IHD, he has got, the age is above 65, there are certain criteria, and he says, look, I'm not very sure that I want to go ahead with dialysis or not, then we'll give them a period of trial. Like try it out for say this much period of time, and at the end of it, we'll discuss again. So that is also another in-between transition. So these, I hope I have somewhere responded. Okay, so moving on. Harrison's medicine has now a chapter on palliative care and also rehabilitation. Everything has come in. So, everywhere this is getting reflected. Only in our healthcare systems, it is just taking too long to come. Even businesses, like there is one crash course on spiritual quotient for businessmen. So they have also touched upon, emotional quotient in business, spiritual quotient. We are only lagging behind, we are still looking at body, multiple things put together into one skin bag. And, that is how we see a patient, not like a flowing river where things keep changing, keeps happening.
It's because we are not having any end of life care policy. Yes.
By the way, how many of y'all have NABH accreditation? Do you know that one of the requirement for NABH is end of life care policy? And all of you may be having a document, but not implemented. Pain policy is an absolute requirement in NABH, but it's not implemented. So, there are little bit available possibilities, but we don't understand what needs to be done to activate a pain policy, what needs to be done to activate end of life care. A lot of education, a lot of awareness is required from the administration, and I have seen hospitals having quality cell to focus on that aspect, to improve the quality of care. So we have to give them skills to evaluate the whole person. So I go to KEM. So now they are trying to do, doing an experiment with students where they adopt a patient. They adopt a patient on voluntary basis. It's not part of the curriculum yet. So they adopt a patient, they get to know everything about the patient, they can follow up the patient as long as they wish. So they get to know the person's disease experience. We are excellent experts in diseases, but who's the expert in disease experience? It is a patient. Unless we know from their point of view, we can't change that experience. We began talking today, talking about experience, the disease experience. So we need to give such kind of skills, and we need to give them something like, something like ethics rounds. That it happens in some, like St. John's Medical College has got this clinical ethics and all. So they do this round, just like how we do grand rounds. We can have, okay, what are the communication gaps in this patient? One round will be only on what are the gaps, what are the medical, ethical dilemmas in these patients. So, there are, at least that point of view is brought into the person's trainee's mind. And attitudes are only by emulating it in the system. Like all of us who are, around students or juniors, we have to be what we want them to be. So 2019, MCI has changed the curriculum and it includes all these now. It's a huge change. So whatever I used to teach in KEM, first and second MBBS, there is a medical humanities department there. So I represent that department and taught for the first few years. But now this year I'm teaching because it's part of the curriculum. So that's great, the huge leap. So same things we are teaching, but now it is part. Only it will become real when it is examined. Because students are going to drop it if there are no exam marks for it. So we need to have some way, like for example in other countries, our exam will be something like, stage 2 patient, CA breast coming, like what are the possible ways of managing. For them it could be that this patient with stage 2 CA breast, has been diagnosed and you have the histopathology report, how will you communicate? That will be their 25 marks question. So unless we bring in this into evaluation, nothing is going to change, because the teachers will not pay attention to it, students will not pay attention to it unless there are marks for it. So we need to do that also. But this has at least come into the syllabus. So the same thing now, to just give wrap up of all that I talked, Ashish we know how to treat. All of us have been doing it for decades. Ahmed, so his issues, we have to understand, persistent in health, recurrent UTIs, bed sores, there are other symptoms. Emotionally, he's young man. Most of our paraplegics are young people, either they fell from a tree or a traffic accident or, bike or something like that. And if they are managed well, why do you think a paraplegic dies? Do they die of paraplegia?
No.
Why do they die? Usually it is bed sores will not kill them. What kills them? Septicemia. Septicemic shock is how they die, and the source of infection is 2 for them: UTI and bed sores. Are these preventable?
Yes.
So we can actually give them a normal lifespan by just bringing in the care component within them. So and socially he has lost his role. He may have a young family. He is not a breadwinner. He is totally depressed, maybe suicidal. You can understand. And spiritually struggle to find, why do I live? This is what leads to, and guilt about maybe if he was drunk and driving and all that, guilt also will be there in his mind. So now what can we do for his physical aspects? So the bedbound young man, first of all we need to help him move himself. There are simple things, like if you put you all must have seen, with a knot, what is it called, a rope with a knot, he's able to hold on to it and sit up. He's able to turn. There are ways of teaching him to be independent, of wearing his own clothes, and we can teach him bowel rhythm by hot water, massage and all. There are ways of making, just like how we finish off our job in the morning, he can also finish off a job, because there are people who are paraplegic who will not eat well because they don't want to trouble their family, and they become so constipated, and all those issues are there. Okay, so bed sores and UTI, both are preventable by teaching adequate skincare, position changing, how to keep the bed sheets, etc. UTI, there is what is it called as clean intermittent self-catheterization. Most of us don't practice. We just put catheter and leave it. It is not necessary. So there are, our own science is advanced enough to prevent. I'm not going into each of it, but because I need to. So instead of saying nothing can be done, a lot of it can be done. So, we can help him understand how to use an airbed or a water bed in his family. Even if they are given, nobody teaches them how to use it. So the airbed, you see, it is just lying with a lot of crumples earlier. In his earlier photograph, you can see this is not the way to use airbed. So a home visit nurse is showing him how to use. And education, then the clean intermittent self-catheterization, physiotherapy, economic self. He was taught, how to make jewelry. Now, it is not our job to teach him how to make jewelry, but we can always have a social worker department. They are there in most hospitals. They can have database of NGOs who do these things. We just need to connect the right persons with that resource. We don't have, but unfortunately, in our hospitals, we are the leaders. Unless we are convinced about doing something, nothing happens. So we cannot say this is not doctor's job, because in WHO definition of health, it is sense of well-being at physical, social, everything. But we just only look at physical, and we have forgotten so curing, caring, comforting, all of them come into our job. But so these are things which we can connect the patient to. So from nothing we can do, there is always something we can do. Even in a patient, so he can have a normal lifespan. And how many jobs are there today where we need to walk? Most of us do most of our work sitting down. So a paraplegic can be a musician, be a computer expert, anything. You know what Stephen Hawking did. So many people have shown us what all can be done. So what happens if we bring in empathy to a system? For a physician, it's like, we understand the patient's requirements better. Patient has increased compliance because they understand why they are doing what they are doing. Better outcomes. Now there are studies showing that when you bring in care with the whatever disease modifying therapy, patients live longer, even in cancer. Yeah. There is a wonderful paper by Temel in 2010 it has come, which shows that in CA lung they have done a study, and simultaneous therapy it's called. The oncology management along with the care. Together, patient survival, which was unexpected outcome. They did not expect it. They thought, okay, quality of life will increase, but quantity of life increased. So this is an important thing to know. And fulfilling what I didn't get in my roles. I told you I was deeply in despair, like what I'm being part of. So that fulfillment comes in when we bring in these dimensions. What happens to the institution if we bring caring? Patient satisfaction, which is a huge thing nowadays. Doctors and nurses with experience of the right skills, reduce rates of medico-legal issues, because whatever is being done with consensus. Correct? Most of the medical legal issues and breaking off hospitals and all happen because of the gaps in communication. If that is taken care of, most of this will not happen. And also your things like ICU, we are very worried about mortality rates. So why do patients with possibly death end up in ICU? Because of this lack of communication, shared decision making, etc. That is why they are all wheeled into the ICU. So when we wheel in the right patients into the ICU, they are more likely to come out. So your mortality rates in the ICU also goes down, because you are getting the family, like in a place like BRCH where there is no question of money. Everything is paid for because there is that CHS scheme and all. So they don't have to change their mind because there is no money. But still there are patients who choose to have their death at home because that is what they prefer. So this is not so much to do with money. It is to do with appropriate and proportionate care. So that is where, so there will be less ICU related mortality, which is again a parameter that you all as administrators may have to demonstrate. Yeah. And it will also increase the research in this area of bringing in care. So now I would like to, and for the patient, of course, it is at best, it will be good quality of care. And at worst, it is, at best, it may be even increased functional years, and at worst, it will be just increased quality of life for the remaining years. So I found the ultimate purpose of medicine with all this, that it is to assist people to experience the fullness of life, and curing, to treat the disease is only a relative purpose. Ultimately, the curing should lead to fullness of life. So if the patient is going to be on ventilator, in US there are children who grow into an adolescent on ventilator. With dadi and mooch and all coming out. And if you take a CT scan of their head, it is all calcified. But that system, we don't have that much money, so hopefully we don't have that kind of a problem. So we need to understand, why am I putting this person on ventilator? Why am I doing dialysis in this patient? Is it assisting him in getting into experiencing life? That is perceiving, hearing, seeing, being able to talk, being able to engage with life. If it is not doing that, then we have to talk to the patient.
Schumacher is on ventilators in so many years.
Now, this is a story of he is a very famous Toby Cosgrove. He's a cardiac surgeon of eminence, and he was giving a talk in an audience, and one of the medical students from different colleges, and one of the students said, I know you are the best heart surgeon whom my father requires, but I will not come to you because you are not empathetic. Okay, you know this happens in America. They are quite outspoken, but he didn't take it lightly. He took this remark to his heart, and and there are some other events also he has described. But then eventually, what he realized that he has unintentionally become a cardiac surgical technician, and exclusively focused on the precision of his work rather than connecting personally, because he says that I had emotionally numbed myself because there are so many things which I can't handle and I don't have the capacity to handle. So I just said, okay, whatever I'm doing, I will do perfectly. So he realized that. So, and he became the CEO of Cleveland Clinic. He did something wonderful. Now there is a short video